It's important to discuss the role of youth in sustainable resource management, and this panel will explore ways to empower the next generation of resource managers and ensure they have the tools and knowledge needed to promote sustainable development. But importantly, we will also hear and learn from them on issues we need to be considering in our work. So then I would like to hand over to Ghadi Sabra, who is lead EGRM Resource Management Young Member Group and UNECE consultant, to moderate this session.
Thank you, Erika. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion entitled Empowering the Next Generation of Resource Managers, so the role of youth in resource management. I thank the Secretariat, EGRM, and its Bureau for giving us the chance to speak today. And of course, I also thank our audience, both in person and online. So of course, as Dario mentioned earlier this week, that we're in it for the long haul. So the youth is a critical stakeholder in this discussion. So we acknowledge the fact that we are, for the effective resource management, the youth is to be considered as critical stakeholders, notably when we speak about meeting the needs for future generations. So in terms of economic growth, social development, and of course, environmental protection. Now, as we move forward with this transition, it is vital to prioritize intergenerational equity to ensure a just and sustainable future for all. Now, I have the honor to share the stage with young members from the Resource Management Young Member Group, also known as RMYMG, which is a young member group. It's an initiative that has recently gained pace over the few last month, and it aims primarily at engaging the youth in resource management and, of course, ensuring intergenerational equity. So I also thank the members of RMYMG who are participating online for their constant support. So the group is currently a subgroup of EGRM under the Communications Working Group, and it strives to harness the diverse perspective and skills of the youth to drive this a just transition, and of course going beyond 2030 and beyond 2050. So the group has two main purposes. First, assisting the work of EGRM in developing, implementing, promoting, and improving UNFC, UNRMS, and sustainable resource management. And the second purpose is to act as an educational platform. So basically, it's a symbiotic trade. We help you, you help us learn. But of course, at the end of this session, we have an open discussion with the audience. So we're open for suggestion and guidance on how to lead this group towards the sustainable path. Now, just a quick overview. This session will focus mainly on the importance of intergenerational equity in resource management to ensure the just, green, and digital transition. During this session, we will discuss the role of this group, young member group, and how we can cooperate to channel the engagement of youth in resource management and provide youth policy advocacy, support capacity building and competency, serve as an educational platform, and bring innovation into the discussion over resource management. We will give a youth perspective on climate change effects, securing raw materials, and environmental, social, and governance considerations. At the end, we will show concrete actions that the young member group can take, can and should take to reduce sustainability threats and enhance resilience with the sustainable resource management. Finally, we will give a perspective from the youth on UNFC. We look forward for this thought-provoking discussion and on these critical issues, of course. I just like to mention that the panelists will give their own personal views and not in relation to their affiliations. Remember, we are young, we are still learning, and we are paving the way forward. So thank you for joining us today. Now, before I introduce the panel, I think I should introduce myself quickly. So I am Ghadi Sabra. I have a bachelor's degree in geology from the American University of Beirut. I later got my master's degree in mining engineering from Politecnico di Torino, where I'm currently doing my PhD in sustainable resource management. I also assist the work of UNECE and EGRM. I would like to introduce now my panel members. First, on the far right, Markus Fischer. Markus, through his young career, demonstrated dedication for solving global environmental challenges. He holds a bachelor's degree in international business from WU Vienna, a master's degree in environmental policy from Sciences Po Paris, and is currently studying his second master's in international relations at Peking University. Markus can also count on diverse work and extracurricular experience from 5 continents. For example, he interned at a research center in Singapore and at an international organization in Brussels and Geneva, where he contributed to publish reports. Further, Markus volunteered for environmental and development projects in South America and Africa. Currently, Markus works with Ørsted, a global leading renewable energy company. Then we have Yuhan Zheng, currently a PhD student in geography at the National University of Ireland, with research focusing on the global governance of climate change and energy transition. Now, right before her PhD track, Yuhan has devoted the last 3.5 years to studying urban sustainability, climate resilience, and smart cities. In September this year, Yuhan will join the UNFCCC Secretariat in Germany in the Intergovernmental Support and Collective Progress Division to contribute and to coordinate the work streams on the global Stocktake and technical dialogue under the Paris Agreement. Next is Vadim Kuznetsov. Vadim is a young professional in energy and climate diplomacy. Currently, he acts as Director of Sustainability and Climate Initiatives at BRICS Youth Energy Agency and is SDG 7 regional focal point for Europe of the UNFCCC. Vadim has vast international experience working on SDG 7 policy at multilateral fora. In 2022, he acted as G20 Youth Delegate to Sustainable and Livable Planet Track under the Indonesian presidency. Vadim is actively engaged in the UNFCCC policy process and has contributed to work of COP26 at the first Youth for Climate Summit in Milan, Italy, and the Glasgow Summit itself. So as well as COP27 with a particular focus on the just energy transition. Then we have Jodi-Ann Wang. Jodi is also a young professional working at the nexus of climate policy and climate finance at the world's largest initiative on responsible investment. She advises global financial institutions and governments on the actions and regulations needed to align finance with equitable transition to net zero. She was a Canadian youth delegate to G20 Indonesia, negotiating on issues related to climate, environment, and sustainable finance. Jodi has a background in international development and climate cooperation within Global South, having received her Master of Philosophy in Development from the University of Cambridge. Lastly, but not least, Bianca Neumann. Bianca has several years of experience in the global, European, and German mining resource industry. She has worked with various organizations such as the European Federation of Geologists, EIT Raw Materials, and currently work with Prognos AG, which is a German policy consultancy firm in the field of innovation and economics. Bianca has completed her bachelor's in political science and economics and is currently pursuing her master's degree in political science with a focus on energy and resource policy and governance. So without further ado, I also like to introduce our last member of the panel, who unfortunately couldn't make it with us today, but I think he's online, Walker Darke, who's also a UNECE consultant. Walker managed to record a video for us to update us on the recent activities of RMYMG and to talk about a bit about the youth involvement. If we can play the video.
Hello, everyone. My name is Walker Darke. I'm a communication consultant at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. I work on resource management as part of the Sustainable Energy team. Today, we're here at UNECE Resource Management Week 2023 to discuss how to get young people more engaged in resource management. Resource management is really, really important. We've heard this week about how resources are finite. We need to be scaling up electric vehicles, wind turbines, renewable energy, and we need to be doing this with finite resources. We need to be doing this more sustainably and in a better, more harmonized way. We have tools and the initiatives to do that. We have the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources that understands and assesses the environmental, socio-economic viability of all projects. We have the United Nations Resource Management System. These are important frameworks to bridge the gap and make sure that everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet. Young people should be a part of this. We are not that far away from the 2030 agenda. We are far from achieving sustainable development and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But the decisions being made now will have an impact during our lifetimes, and young people should be at the table and should be on the stage to make their voice heard and be a part of the political and decision-making process. So hopefully today is a call to action. We now have the Resource Management Young Members Group that's revitalized and reinvigorated. We've been having calls since March with over 40 members from all around Europe, North America, Central Asia, and beyond to try and get young people on the agenda and hear what young people think, what they want to see, and what they're doing in their local communities, in their industry, in their government, in their study on how to make resource management more sustainable. Today, we're going to hear from some top delegates, young people from academia, from industry, and from government, really making huge waves in resource management and hearing their thoughts on what they're doing and how you can support too. We'd love you to join the Resource Management Young Members Group and play an active role in this. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope we have a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, Walker, for this intervention. And yes, as Walker mentioned, the forum is open for anyone who would like to send some young members towards our way, of course. Now that we got to know the panelists, and now it's time to start digging deep into the questions. So we start with the basic question. We've heard a lot about intergenerational equity It's quite well embedded in the purposes of this young member group and has been quite a buzzword in the fight against climate change. So I'd like to address my first question to Jodi. Jodi, what does it mean and how does intergenerational equity apply in the case of this young member group?
Thank you, Ghadi, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So let's set the scene a little bit on this buzzword that is intergenerational equity. I think to me, fundamentally, it's about fairness and justice in relationships between the current generations and all future generations. And in today's context, mineral resources extracted from the ground and investments in productive assets need to be made in a way that leaves the future generations with as much as we have right now. And so fundamentally, it's about striking a balance between needs and interests across different generations. But we also live in the current context, there's a collision. There's a collision between the global ecosystem that is shrinking and the human economy that is expanding. And so institutions need to construct administrative acts that balance the short-term needs of today's generation with the longer-term needs of the future generations. And so by thinking about those systems and by thinking about the broad concept of intergenerational equity, I think three pillars emerge as tangible things that we can do or we can strive for to ensure that future generations have as many opportunities as we have today. And you'll hear the panelists today kind of address on some of these pillars. One, I think, is protecting natural diversity and also protecting the quality of the environment. And lastly, ensuring the access of opportunities for all. I think when we talk about intergenerational equity, the first actionable step is to create a platform, create a vehicle for all generations to come together and discuss and engage. You need to be in the room and you need to have a seat at the table, as you know, we've all heard the catchphrase before. And so the RMYMG has, in a way, provided that for us already. And that's why we're here today, kind of having this conversation together. But what's the next step to ensuring intergenerational equity in all the conversations that we've had throughout this week? I think there are three things to me. One, kind of reckoning with the question of resource management for whom and resource management how. And by having youth at the table, I think we add another angle to the discussion and the debate. So the expertise that we provide together are more holistic and more rounded. We're here and we can challenge kind of some of the timescale of the thinking and timescale of decision making, both in policy and in finance, by injecting that intertemporal perspectives, thinking beyond, you know, if we're thinking about climate, the goals of 2030 and 2050, but way beyond, centuries after that. We're also broadening the issue a bit. For example, some things that we've been talking about amongst the youth groups a lot is deep sea mining. We've discussed a lot resource extraction and management on land, but we know that the first commercial application to mine the seafloor could be approved as early as July this year, which unleashes a new industry on the ocean that can cause irreparable change to the deep sea ecosystems. I lead the Commonwealth Youth Climate Change Network, and 1 in 3 people between the age of 15 and 29 in this world live in a Commonwealth country. And we know that the Commonwealth countries have a huge representation in Pacific Island states, many of whom are put in a position to have to choose between economic prosperity and local livelihoods vis-a-vis protecting natural environments. And no countries or no communities should be put in that position to have to make a choice between the two. And given the demographics and the populations of these groups, you know, having these conversations is about intergenerational equity at the end. And I think lastly, what I'll say is a lot of the frameworks and the technical discussions that we have here, but by having youth at the table where we're still yet to gain that years and decades of industry experiences, hopefully we're here to push to make these information a bit more accessible and a bit more digestible for all to understand and advocate on behalf. So I'll stop there and pass it back to Ghadi.
Thank you, Jodi. I'd ask the panel members if anyone would like to intervene or expand. Okay. Thank you, Jodi, for your answer. Moving a bit to the impact of the generational shift, I ask Yuhan, how do generational shifts affect the effects of this generational shift on the current resource management practices? And what step can we take to ensure a sustainable future for the generation, given the time we have? And do we still have the time?
Actually, when we are talking about the generational things or generation, actually it's more about a temporary aspect that we need to like further interrogate, like how long it will take to the transitions from the originally resource management pathways to a more sustainable ways, or to a more like a more ecological ways into our social ecology existence, to make the resource management really in a sustainable way. So it's about temporary considerations. It's just like we interrogate, like in just few days, our planet's population will cross a new threshold towards a broad new generations. And in geological sense, that we are transitioning from the Holocene to the Anthropocene nowadays. But actually, there is a tipping process, like the Earth's tipping process, which transitions from the original Holocene to the current Anthropocene. But actually, there is a part of the social tipping process that it's not like into every brick or model that integrated every flows of the materials or something, but it's about the social norms or the everyday practice, how the everyday practice will really also inform the way of the management of the resources. So here we can like observe when we are going to like transit our resource management way into a more sustainable one, or using kind of like different technical interventions or other things to really intervene this kind of process, we have organized or we have identified some rapid rates of the changes that can observe under the certain critical conditions in our natural socio-economic and socio-ecological systems. So the increasing attention is being given to the concept of the tipping dynamics as a non-linear mechanism behind such disruptive systems, because sometimes we plan or we invest in our resource management like paradigms or something like that. Sometimes the resource like transition path is not going on its way as we planned, like we have like 10 years plans or 12 years plans, but actually sometimes there's some rapid change or rapid like paradigm shift of our way of managing the resources of our Earth, like into from this stage to a rapidly increase of the change. So this is the tipping dynamics, and it's closely related to how we people like perceive this kind of resources management way and how we really contribute to this. And within our social ecological systems, which is like the social tipping dynamics is defined as which a small quantitative change inevitably triggers a non-linear changes in a social component of the social ecological systems, driven by the self-reinforcing positive feedback mechanisms that inevitably and often irreversibly lead to a qualitatively different state of the social system as a whole. So there are also like various types of the tipping process by different like scholars has also explored. It's just like sometimes it's closely related. Just for example, just now the team has introduced the circular economic systems, how we put this series into the practice. So I remember there's a slide, a butterfly circles in the slide we just say just now, and actually there is a butterfly effect actually happens in our social norms or in our everyday practice. It's like bringing the very broad or exaggerated series into our everyday practice, and that really needs our interventions or our identifications of how this kind of like different elements, or we want to put this series into practice. But every step is important to engage the public and to engage the local communities and really engage in it in a way or in a tipping way that can really contribute to this one. So I think the most important part for our young generations and also for all generations is how we really know the process, like when it goes from the series into policies and into practice. So what we need to do is to educate people or to create more and more like knowledge sharing platforms for us to really interpret this kind of like broad series into a more practical way. And that's my part of this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuhan. Would anyone like to add something? Perfect. Let's expand the discussion more on a global perspective. I go back to you, Jodi. So on a global scale, what does intergenerational equity look like? And especially along the full supply chain of critical raw materials and all actors therein. So in terms of producers, investors, governments, etc.
I'll try to keep it short, but I think that the first thing to think about the equity aspect is also think about the issues that are interlinked with resource management, resource extraction, things like food security and sanitation, biodiversity conservation, clean water access, public health equity, housing equity. All of these are issues with generational impacts, and the decisions that we make today, the financing decisions that we make today, will have huge implications for years to come. But just to give a few examples, I guess, along the value chain, if we're looking at the production of resources, 54% of projects extracting clean energy minerals will take place on indigenous lands globally, many in the global south. So how do we not only the most basic step, ensuring free, prior, informed consent, but also to make sure that these communities capture the green industrial upgrading and benefit from the industrial value add in the value chain, from processing, materials production. I think earlier our colleague from the Africa Mining Vision presented that graph of the need to go the entire value chain, not just stop at the third step. And also to recognize that these lands on which the mindset will hold immense ecological and cultural values, many of which are non-economically quantifiable. So how do we shift the existing framework and considerations of what value is, and to consider these intangible values that are very much interlinked with one's identities? And for investors in finance, another key actor in the value chain. So I work with a lot of responsible investors, but I think that the discussion that we have is there's yet to be a consensus amongst the financial actors on allocating capital towards sustainable mining practices that meet the growing demand and do not cause harm to people, communities, and the environment. And investors have a responsibility to work with portfolio companies and wider industry to ensure accountability and transparency, not only for their own social license to operate, but also for the greater public good. So here, standardization, not only standardization, but consistency and interoperability in these standardizations are key. And that brings in another actor, which is governments, in terms of standard setting, but not only setting the standards, but kicking them into regulation, putting in the right policy mixes with price incentives, as well as social policies to protect communities. So the current demand for critical raw materials are delivered sustainably and responsibly. And that's just 3 examples, but there are a whole lot more actors along the value chain that can play a critical part in ensuring that intergenerational equity is centered in the process.
Thank you for that, Jodi. And speaking of investment in more on a wider aspect, the economy, and specifically the green economy. So let's discuss a bit about the opportunities for the young people in this new green economy. So I move to Markus. Solving the environmental crisis will come with drastic changes to our economic system, of course, but it will require new infrastructures, innovation, and clean technologies. Do you see opportunities for young people in this change?
Yes, thank you very much. And the short answer would be yes, I do see opportunities, but let me maybe give a bit more also nuanced and broader view. And let me also reiterate that I do speak on behalf of a member of the young member group and not on behalf of Ørsted. So as Jodi said and talked about intergenerational equity, I can only fully agree. You know, sustainable resource management to me is by definition leaving enough resources for future generations. And then Yuhan, you went into talking about the the geological transition we are facing in the Earth's tipping process. And I would like to focus a bit on what avoiding such a tipping process and what achieving intergenerational equity, what that means for the economic system and the changes we would see in the economic system. And I will focus on energy and on resources. Let me start with energy and refer to the International Energy's World Energy Outlook, which I'm sure most of you or many of you are familiar with. But in their modeling of the future energy system, the net zero energy system, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, sees that we will have a total energy supply of roughly 550 exajoules in 2050, and less than 100 of these 550 will be fossil fuels, and most of the fossil fuels will be abated. However, wind and solar alone will constitute over 200 exajoules. So we clearly see this move away from sort of a fossil-based economy to an economy that is based on renewable resources. There will also be a change in energy carriers, and electricity will become, and I quote again the IEA, the new oil in terms of its dominance in energy consumption, being across industry, transport, buildings, everywhere more than 50% of the consumption. Now, moving on from energy to resources, right? Because these two go hand in hand. The energy transition as such will also have implications on resources and the demand for critical minerals. And this is also something that has been discussed in detail here. But for clean energy technologies, critical mineral demand will increase sharply, more than, again, according to the IEA, double from today's level to 2030. And then, of course, different minerals with different growth projections. But overall, we will see that strengthening growth. Now, let me come to what does this mean for young people and for youth. And let me start by the opportunity that is very clear here. There will be no new job opportunities. There's a need for education, and there will be new skills needed in the economy. And at the moment, we actually do have a skills shortage when it comes to the energy transition. I'm having some data, not for a global level now, but for a European level, where EU Commission data says that by 2030, 500,000 new jobs will be needed only for the manufacturing of the heat pumps and the solar panels and the clean energy products. And then if we add the resource extraction that is needed and scale that to a global level, we can see we're easily in the millions of new jobs that are needed. Or giving a simple example, and I think that's also what Walker mentioned in the beginning, there won't be a need so much for a mechanic of an internal combustion engine, but maybe an electric vehicle software engineer. You won't need to install a gas boiler, but perhaps a heat pump, and you might need the refrigeration engineers for that. And similarly, of course, in the extractive industry, where extraction of fossil fuels will continue to play a role, but they're substantially less important. But then management of new resources will be very key. So managing the carbon with the carbon capture and storage and the circular carbon economy, then hydrogen as well, geothermal, and of course the raw materials needed for the electrification. So we see sort of that change as well, and that will again require different skills and require different jobs. And we as young people that are coming into the economy now, that are coming into the labor market now, we can bring these skills, but clearly we lack expertise. And there's people in the economy who have decades of experience working in resource management and in resource extraction. And I believe that the young people coming in with the new skills in mind, working together with people with experience, can really be a large opportunity for the economy. So we can ensure that these two go hand in hand. And let me end here by maybe quoting The Who is like sort of a band, maybe not from my generation, but there's this one quote which says, "I'm not trying to cause a big sensation, but I'm just trying to talk about my generation." And I think instead of talking about my generation, we should talk about our generations and how the young generation can work together with more experienced older generations, so we can realize these opportunities in the economy and avert an environmental catastrophe.
I have a short question. What band was that quote from?
I believe it's The Who, so I think it's
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Lovely quote, Markus, especially in the context. I'll go to Vadim now. Vadim, I hear you talk a lot about multilateral resource management systems. So, so why should we, or why should the multilateral system, resource management system, stop prioritizing climate actions over environmental health?
Thank you, Ghadi. And in fact, I'm going to provide a critical perspective on how we manage our resources now and how we approach our SDG 7 progress, SDG 7 being the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal on energy. In fact, now what we see in the global public policy discourse, in policies being adopted and at multilateral institutions such as this one, is that oftentimes climate action is prioritized over environmental health, which means that our energy transition is progressing, but with a very high cost. And we are advancing on our way towards achieving SDG 7 as it is fixed, as it was fixed back in 2015, which means very clear metrics. So this and that percentage of renewables by that or that year. It's a merely numerical approach. And we, in some parts of the world, especially the region, our region, the European region, we will probably get there. But will this be a just, green, and equitable energy transition? It won't, because it will come at a large environmental cost. I would like to quote or mention two major international multilateral documents that were adopted last year, and that are very timely in nature because they are aimed at protecting our environment and preserving it for future generations. So isn't that what sustainable development is? First, it is the United Nations General Assembly resolution on the right to a clean and healthy environment. And the second document is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I guess all member states present, all experts participating will not object and will not say anything against those two documents because they are essential in the world we live now. And yet, if we look at how we construct our climate policies, they go into a direct clash with those two documents and overall how our energy transition ideally should be proceeding. My colleague mentioned deep sea mining as one of the major topics that is currently on the global agenda. Indeed, as soon as this summer, the International Seabed Authority might authorize for the first time in history a commercial exploitation contract in the so-called Clipperton Triangle in the Pacific. And one of the underlying challenges that accompanies this decision is that the UN member states still lack a common and agreed environmental code that would regulate extraction in the area, which is a UN term, and in everybody's term, it is just no one's waters, because they are beyond national jurisdiction. This would mean that any company extracting critical minerals from the seabed will be responsible just on its own. How honest and transparent companies around the world are, I think we can have a debate on that, but unfortunately we won't have time. And given that we are here at in a policy context where everything that serious should and even must be regulated, we need to think about such decisions beforehand to make sure that we, on the one hand, do not block any viable economic progress, which is much needed given that for the energy transition, for clean technologies, we need excessive amounts of critical materials and critical minerals. And yet, on the other hand, we need to make sure that our decisions are conscious of environmental consequences that this might cause. I did not mention Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in vain, because in fact, it stipulates the right and obligation of UN member states, parties to the CBD, to protect the marine environment. And as we don't have such a code, such a multilateral agreement yet, but the first contract might be authorized very soon, what is the equation? We'll start exploiting that without any environmental regulations in place. Also, speaking about the value chain approach, as of now, given the climate policy predominance and I'm still arguing about that, we do not pay attention to the whole value chain sustainability. We measure our impact against the metrics that we adopted back in 2015 when the world was much different. And it's basically based on the end user's well-being. So me as an end user, be it an industry, a member state, an individual, a household owning an e-vehicle, I managed to reduce my CO2 emissions by this or that %. So I'm moving towards accomplishing my climate goals. And in this paradigm, I'm doing everything I can to achieve SDG 7. I'm acting right. From the perspective we in the group are discussing now, it would be much more viable, both socially and economically, and just right, to assess our progress across the whole value chain. It's not just only about the end user benefiting from having yet another wind turbine or yet another solar panel. It oftentimes happens in the so-called global north, in wealthy countries that may afford transitioning from carbon intense to low carbon and zero carbon technologies. And yet, those areas and communities where those metals are sourced, they oftentimes belong to very different contexts, economic and social contexts in the global south. Those are communities that are not on the, using the UN language, are not on the path towards achieving SDG 7 just because they cannot make a transition, since many of them do not have energy. They do not have access to any sort of energy, or they use charcoal to power their households. That's it. So if we want to make this transition truly equitable, just, and sustainable, we need to ensure that we apply our stringent environmental criteria and wider ESG criteria across the whole value chain, not just assessing our progress if our end user is happy and satisfied with accomplishing their climate goals. In this regard, adhering to some unilateral initiatives might be very appealing because it works faster. The multilateral environment is very slow. This is one of the key hurdles on this way. But yet, if we just regulate something in a fragmented way, we will never ensure a truly sustainable value chain, which takes those critical minerals to our industries, to our countries, especially in the European region, because in the European region, we don't have much extraction of those critical minerals. It's usually countries in the Latin American region, in Africa, and in Southeast Asia. So I wanted to mention that because I think oftentimes we stick to a very popular and catchy discourse on ensuring a truly just and inclusive transition, but it's not just and inclusive as of now. One of the solutions to that, beyond multilateral commitment, also lies in bringing up a new cohort, a new group, a new generation of resource managers. I would like to echo Markus's point on preparing not only green, like in the green jobs paradigm, preparing not only those assembling technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, etc., because it's also about the end user's wealth. We should also, beyond that, we should also focus on preparing those new resource managers who work right at the inception of this global value chain, which is in the extraction industry. On the other hand, we should also empower and train and invest into preparing a new generation of resource management on the disposal edge, on the disposal end. Because if we want to close the loop, we need to think of circular solutions, which is yet another buzzword, which has a lot of potential to materialize in something viable. We have many examples across the European region how those attempts are currently being implemented, but that's not enough. So we should not be focusing just on assembling something. It has its own life cycle. Once it comes to an end, we need to make sure we waste as little as possible. Wasting nothing is a utopia.
Thank you, Vadim. Thank you for these strong remarks, and we'll continue over the coffee break later. Okay, so we've talked about many topics, and now to a more technical aspect and something we've discussed throughout this whole week, which is the UNFC. So I'd like to ask Bianca about her youthful perspective on the barriers that might hinder the implementation of UNFC on a global scale, and how can we channel the RMYMG member group and to provide the support and overcome these barriers.
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. And second of all, thank you for all of your inspiring thoughts. Just listening to you guys, I feel like it's very inspiring and hopefully motivates people online to join us as a group. We've been talking about the tremendous potential that UNFC has to ensure sustainable development, especially in the resource industry. We've also talked about the barriers, which include the high fragmentation of the global governance structure, which makes it really difficult to implement UNFC and other standards. We got the global level, the national level, the sub-state level. So that's one of the big challenges. We got the resistance to change within the industries. We got the costs of implementation, the lack of awareness, and also the question of quality control when it comes to the assessment. For time's sake, I think I'm going to focus on the barriers that the youth and RMYMG especially can play a role in overcoming. And for once, that is the resistance to change within the industry, because oftentimes that is seen, I mean, it comes from an economic perspective. And in my opinion, it's not a static factor, it's dynamic. I think the youth has demonstrated to be able to weigh in other factors than just economic factors in the industry, in social life. And I mean, I don't want to seem naive here. I know that economic incentives play a major role in the industry, but it is a dynamic factor. And if there's a political will and also the will within the industry, I think there is the change can be driven. And I mean, that's been stressed before. We are the future of the industry, so we are the future industry representatives too. Then when it comes to the lack of awareness, I think RMYMG can play a big role too. You've all been to other conferences, and I'm always surprised how little people know within the industries about UNFC. So there's a big lack of awareness also within students. Only very few universities teach about UNFC. And I think the resistance to change can be influenced by creating an environment, by creating more acceptance, by introducing the industry on conferences, by introducing the university to UNFC. And the Critical Raw Materials Act introduced UNFC too, but I feel like for many people this was a very rapid change. But if we create an onboarding process, like a slower introduction to the whole concept and to the standard, I feel like the cooperation acceptance will be much higher. And well, just to keep it short, there's also the question of quality control. It used to be the competent person, now it's the qualified expert, I think. So depending on depending on how qualified the experts are, the output of the assessment can be used for different purposes. So we have to ask the questions: are the assessments going to be used for investors, politicians, or just public entities? And again, if we create awareness, if we introduce the youth, we can create an environment in which the quality of the qualified experts and the expertise can be improved to have a more holistic and understanding comprehension of this complex standard. And just as a last sentence, we've been talking about resources for the whole week, and I would like to remember and remind every one of you that I think the youth is a resource that can be accessed quite well. And if it's accessed sustainably and efficiently, it's one that can make a big difference within the industry and sustainable development in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bianca, for this answer. And just to expand a bit on the awareness at the academic levels, it's not just about UNFC. Sustainable resource management in general is lacking in that area. So that's why we expect the support for this young member group. We've seen a lot globally, a lot of other organizations, youth organizations about climate change, environmental impacts, many more, but nothing seriously on sustainable resource management. So on that note, I'd like, do we have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience, or?
I think we can take one question. So, Teresa?
Thank you. I must stand up for this. Thank you for the very nice cool breeze you brought to us with so many interesting thoughts. That's why you should be ambassadors of UNRMS. UNRMS intends to be everything you said, to go through the value chain, to tackle all the objective goals, to connect with the green taxonomy that, as you know, doesn't just look at the transition issue. It looks also at the environment, and so I think it's also about digitalization that we need. So we need your skills for this transition. So I think I incentivize you to help us and to collaborate in the UNRMS system. I also incentivize you to tackle other groups. The World Energy Council has a youth, it's future energy leaders. They are more related with energy. Maybe this complementary would be very good. And if I can, I would be very glad to help this connection.